a new airline CEO boards his company's flight undercover, hoping to observe his staff without their professional masks on. But when a white flight attendant spits in his face, thinking he's just a nobody, the entire cabin is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them all reeling. It was a crisp Thursday morning at Atlanta International Airport when Mason Rodriguez stepped onto Flight 2317 bound for Chicago. Dressed in a simple navy hoodie, faded jeans, and worn sneakers, he didn't look like someone who had spent the last 15 years climbing the corporate ladder at one of America's largest airlines. That was exactly his intention. Mason believed in seeing organizations for what they truly were, not through the polished lens of scheduled meetings or rehearsed presentations. As a black man stepping into the CEO position at Skyline Airways, a company plagued by whispers of poor employee culture and discrimination complaints, he wanted to observe the airline's operations unfiltered. What better way to do that than to blend in as an ordinary passenger? The boarding area buzzed with travelers rushing to make connections. Mason scanned the gate, noting the flight attendants' interactions with passengers. Some were warm and welcoming, others appeared stressed, and a few seemed completely disconnected. No one recognized him, which wasn't surprising. His appointment had been announced just days ago, and he had chosen not to publicize his arrival until the official introduction later that afternoon. He adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and took a deep breath. He was no stranger to resistance in corporate America, but he knew this job would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. As he approached the boarding gate, the faint sound of a heated exchange carried through the air. Mason observed a young mother with a crying infant being berated by a flight attendant for having too many carry-on items. The attendant's voice was sharp, her gestures dismissive. But what caught Mason's attention was how differently she treated the well-dressed white businessman who approached next with the same number of bags. "Boarding pass, please," the gate agent said as Mason reached the front of the line. He handed over his economy class ticket, purchased from his personal account rather than using the executive reservation system. The agent barely looked at him before waving him through. The narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 was congested with passengers stowing luggage and finding seats. Mason made his way toward the back of the plane, carefully observing the crew's interactions. Most seemed professional enough, if not particularly warm. Then he noticed her, a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a name tag that read Megan Nelson. Something about her demeanor set off warning bells. As Mason approached his row, he could see Megan assisting a white passenger with stowing a bulky carry-on, her smile wide and voice cheerful. The moment turned when an elderly black woman asked for the same assistance, and Megan's entire demeanor shifted. Her smile vanished, her tone became clipped, and she quickly muttered that passengers needed to handle their own bags if they brought them aboard. Mason slid into his middle seat in row 27. Between a teenage girl absorbed in her phone and a businessman typing furiously on a laptop. From this vantage point, he could observe much of the cabin without drawing attention to himself. For the next 20 minutes, he watched Megan's interactions carefully, noting the pattern emerging: warm, accommodating service for white passengers, curt, sometimes dismissive treatment for passengers of color. The flight was preparing for departure when a young black man in a suit, later, Mason would learn his name was William Davis, requested a bottle of water before takeoff. Megan's response was immediate and jarring. "You'll have to wait until beverage service like everyone else," she snapped, despite having just handed a white woman in first class a pre-departure drink. William, clearly taken aback by her tone, replied calmly, "I have medication I need to take now. I just need a small cup of water." Megan's eyes narrowed. "I said you'll have to wait. There are rules on this aircraft." Mason watched as William's face registered the double standard. The young man took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be difficult, but I really do need to take this medication now. Is there any way you could—" "Listen," Megan cut him off, her voice rising. "I've told you twice now. If you can't follow simple instructions, maybe you shouldn't be flying today." The cabin grew quiet. Mason felt his pulse quicken as he witnessed the humiliation being inflicted on William. He was about to intervene when another flight attendant, her name tag read Olivia Davis, appeared with a cup of water. "Here you go, sir," Olivia said quietly, handing the water to William. The look Megan shot Olivia could have frozen the entire cabin. But before she could say anything, the captain announced they were third in line for takeoff, and all flight attendants needed to be seated. The first hour of the flight passed without incident. Mason observed the crew's interactions, making mental notes about the dynamics at play. Olivia seemed to treat all passengers with equal respect, while Megan continued her pattern of discriminatory behavior. Another flight attendant, Jennifer Collins, appeared to follow Megan's lead, though less overtly. Mason was contemplating how deep this issue might run throughout the company when commotion erupted several rows ahead. A voice rose above the ambient noise of the aircraft. It was William again, and Megan was standing over him, her posture rigid with anger. "I specifically asked for ginger ale," William was saying, his voice controlled but firm. "This is the second time you've brought me something I didn't request." "Well, we're out of ginger ale," Megan replied, her tone dismissive. "You'll have to make do with what you got." Mason watched as a white passenger across the aisle raised his hand. "Excuse me, could I get a ginger ale?" Without missing a beat, Megan smiled. "Of course, sir." She reached into her cart and produced a can of ginger ale, handing it to the man with a warm smile. The audacity of the moment stunned the surrounding passengers into silence. William stared at the interaction, disbelief evident on his face. When he found his voice, it was steady but tinged with justified anger. "So you do have ginger ale," he said. "You just didn't want to give me any." Megan turned to him, her expression hardening. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying you just gave that man what you told me you didn't have," William replied. "Maybe you should lower your voice," Megan warned, her hand moving to the call button. "We don't tolerate aggressive behavior on this aircraft." Mason had seen enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, making his way toward the confrontation. As he approached, he could hear William defending himself. "I'm not being aggressive. I'm simply pointing out that—" "Sir," Megan cut him off, her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, "if you continue to harass me, I'll have the captain divert this flight and have you removed." Several passengers gasped. The threat of diversion was extreme, especially given the minor nature of the complaint. Mason stepped into the aisle, now just a few feet from the confrontation. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "I couldn't help but overhear. It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Megan turned to him, irritation flashing across her face. "This doesn't concern you. Please return to your seat." "Actually," Mason continued, his voice even, "I've been observing your interactions throughout this flight, and there seems to be a pattern to how you treat certain passengers differently than others." The color drained from Megan's face, replaced quickly by a flush of anger. "Who do you think you are?" she hissed. "Right now, I'm just a concerned passenger," Mason replied. "But I'm curious why this gentleman was told there was no ginger ale when you clearly had some to offer." Megan's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You need to mind your own business and return to your seat immediately." "Megan, maybe we should," Olivia began, but Megan cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I don't need your help," she snapped before turning back to Mason. "This is the final time I'm asking you to return to your seat before I report you for interfering with a flight attendant's duties." Mason didn't move. "I'm simply asking why you're treating passengers differently based on their race. That's a fair question, isn't it?" The word race hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several passengers murmured in agreement, having witnessed the same behavior. What happened next would later be viewed millions of times on social media. Megan's face contorted with rage, and before anyone could react, she leaned forward and spat directly into Mason's face. "How dare you accuse me of racism?" she seethed, her voice trembling with fury. "You people always play the race card when you don't get your way." Before we continue, let us know where in the world you are watching from, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss tomorrow's interesting video. Now let's continue with the story. Mason's breath hitched as the warm saliva dripped down his cheek. Around him, passengers gasped in shock. Someone shouted for the captain. William sat frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mason reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his face. His movements were deliberate, controlled, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Is this how Skyline Airways trains its staff to respond to passenger concerns?" he asked, his voice remarkably calm given the circumstances. Megan's expression remained defiant, though a flicker of uncertainty had begun to creep in. "You don't know anything about Skyline or how we operate?" "Actually," Mason replied, carefully folding the handkerchief and placing it back in his pocket, "I know quite a bit about Skyline Airways." Before he could continue, the cockpit door opened and the captain emerged, flanked by the head flight attendant, a woman whose name tag identified her as Ava Walker. "What's going on here?" Captain Benjamin Garcia demanded, his expression stern as he surveyed the scene. Megan immediately stepped toward him. "These passengers are being disruptive and threatening. I've asked them repeatedly to return to their seats, but they're refusing to comply." Several voices rose at once, passengers eager to correct the record. Ava raised her hands, calling for quiet. "One at a time, please," she said firmly. "Sir," she addressed Mason, "could you explain what happened?" Mason nodded, maintaining his composure. "This gentleman," he gestured to William, "was told there was no ginger ale available, only to watch as the same flight attendant served it to another passenger moments later. When he questioned this, he was threatened with having the flight diverted. When I intervened to ask about the discrepancy, the flight attendant spat in my face." Murmurs of confirmation rippled through the cabin. Several passengers held up phones, indicating they had recorded the incident. Captain Garcia's expression darkened. "Megan, is this true?" "Of course not," Megan scoffed. "They're exaggerating. I did not spit on anyone." "I have it on video," a passenger called out, holding up her phone. "She spat on him." Ava looked horrified. "Megan, come with me right now," she said, her voice low but firm. "You're taking their side?" Megan asked incredulously. "You know how these people can be, always making mountains out of molehills." "These people?" Mason repeated, his eyebrow raised. "And who exactly would these people be, Miss Nelson?" The use of her last name caught Megan off guard. She blinked, suddenly uncertain. "How do you know my last name?" "Your name badge only shows your first name," William pointed out, his voice steady despite the tension. A flicker of recognition crossed Megan's face as she studied Mason more carefully. "Who are you?" she demanded, a note of apprehension creeping into her voice. Mason reached into his backpack and pulled out a business card, handing it to Captain Garcia. The captain's eyes widened as he read it, then looked up at Mason with newfound understanding. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, his voice taking on a respectful tone, "we weren't expecting you until this afternoon." "I prefer to see things as they really are, Captain," Mason replied, "not as people pretend them to be when they know they're being watched." Confusion spread across Megan's face. "What's going on? Who is he?" Captain Garcia handed the card to Ava, whose mouth dropped open slightly. She turned to Megan, her expression grave. "Megan, this is Mason Rodriguez. He's Skyline's new CEO." The color drained from Megan's face. She stared at Mason, her expression cycling rapidly through disbelief, horror, and then desperation. I didn't know. I would never have." "You would never have what?" Mason asked, his voice level. "You would never have treated me that way if you knew who I was?" "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? You believed I was just another powerless black man you could disrespect without consequences." The cabin had gone completely silent, every passenger riveted by the unfolding drama. Megan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Captain," Mason said, turning to Garcia, "I'd like Miss Nelson removed from the flight crew immediately. When we land, she'll be suspended pending a full investigation." "Yes, sir," Captain Garcia nodded. "Ava, please escort Megan to the crew rest area for the remainder of the flight. Jennifer will cover her section." As Ava led a shell-shocked Megan toward the front of the plane, Mason turned to the passengers. "I apologize for the disruption, everyone. Skyline Airways strives to provide respectful service to all our passengers, regardless of race, gender, or any other characteristic. Today, we clearly failed to live up to that standard, and for that, I am deeply sorry." He then turned to William, extending his hand. "I'm Mason Rodriguez, and I'd like to personally apologize for how you were treated today." William shook his hand, still looking slightly dazed by the turn of events. "William Davis," Thank you for stepping in." As Mason returned to his seat, murmurs spread throughout the cabin. Some passengers applauded softly, while others exchanged looks of satisfaction at seeing justice served so swiftly. For the remainder of the flight, the atmosphere was charged with a peculiar energy, part tension, part vindication. When they landed in Chicago, Mason was the last to deplane. As he stepped into the jetway, he found Captain Garcia and Ava waiting for him. "Mr. Rodriguez," Captain Garcia began, "I want to assure you that Ms. Nelson's behavior is not representative of our crew." "Isn't it, though?" Mason asked quietly. "How long has she been with Skyline?" 8 years, Ava answered, her expression troubled. "And in those 8 years, how many complaints have been filed against her?" Ava and Captain Garcia exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Several," Ava admitted, "but none that resulted in disciplinary action." "And why is that?" Mason pressed. "The complaints were difficult to prove," Captain Garcia replied, his discomfort evident. "It was always her word against the passengers." Mason nodded slowly. "And yet today, multiple passengers witnessed and recorded her behavior. The difference isn't that she suddenly became discriminatory. The difference is that it finally became impossible to ignore." The truth of his words hung heavy in the air. Neither Ava nor Captain Garcia could meet his eyes. "I don't believe in public humiliation as a management strategy," Mason continued, his tone softer now. "But I do believe in accountability. Miss Nelson will have due process, but if the investigation confirms what I witnessed today, her employment with Skyline will be terminated." "Yes, sir," they both murmured. "More importantly," Mason added, "this incident highlights a systemic issue. How many other Megans do we have at Skyline? How many complaints have been dismissed because they were difficult to prove? And what message does that send to our employees and passengers about what behaviors we're willing to tolerate?" The questions weren't meant to be answered immediately, but the weight of them was evident in the troubled expressions that crossed their faces. "I'll see you both at headquarters in an hour," Mason concluded, adjusting his backpack strap. "We have a lot of work to do." As Mason walked through O'Hare International Airport toward the executive car waiting to take him to Skyline's Chicago headquarters, his phone buzzed with notifications. The incident had already hit social media, with videos spreading rapidly across platforms. #Skyline Spit was trending nationally. Mason sighed, knowing the PR nightmare that awaited him. But perhaps this very public incident was exactly what the company needed. A catalyst for the difficult conversations and substantive changes that had been avoided for too long. The executive conference room at Skyline headquarters was packed by the time Mason arrived. Board members, department heads, and legal counsel had assembled hastily, many still unaware of what had transpired. Whispers ceased as Mason entered the room, all eyes turning to him with curiosity and apprehension. Riley Cooper, the chairman of the board, stepped forward. "Mason, we were expecting you for the official welcome this afternoon. There are rumors circulating about an incident on a flight this morning." "Not rumors," Mason corrected, setting his backpack down. "Facts. And before we begin, I want to make something clear. What happened today isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about the culture that allowed her behavior to continue unchecked for years." He recounted the events on the flight, his voice steady but firm. When he finished, the room was silent, faces reflecting varying degrees of shock and dismay. Cody Clark, the head of Human Resources, was the first to speak. "I can assure you, Mr. Rodriguez, that we have strict anti-discrimination policies in place." "Policies are just words on paper if they're not enforced," Mason replied. "How many similar complaints have been filed against Skyline employees in the past 5 years? And how many resulted in meaningful action?" Cody shifted uncomfortably. "I'd have to check the records." "I already have," Mason said, pulling a folder from his backpack. 372 complaints alleging racial discrimination by flight crew, 12 investigations launched, 0 terminations. He let the statistics hang in the air. "That's not a failure of policy. That's a failure of will." The tension in the room was palpable as Mason laid out his vision for transformation. Mandatory bias training for all employees, an overhaul of the complaint investigation process, and 0 tolerance for discriminatory behavior. "Some of you might be thinking this is an overreaction to a single incident," Mason acknowledged. But ask yourselves this. If Megan Nelson felt comfortable behaving that way in a cabin full of witnesses, knowing there could be consequences, what happens when there are no witnesses? What happens in those moments when vulnerable passengers have no recourse, no way to prove their experiences? Several executives averted their eyes, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in the system that had allowed such behavior to fester. Over the next few months, Skyline Airways underwent a painful but necessary transformation. Mason's approach was thorough and unyielding. The investigation into Megan Nelson uncovered a history of similar incidents, resulting in her termination. More importantly, it sparked a comprehensive review of all outstanding complaints, many of which were reopened and reinvestigated. And gradually, the culture began to shift. New reporting mechanisms made it easier for passengers to document their experiences. A diverse team of investigators ensured complaints were taken seriously. Training programs helped employees recognize and address their own biases. 6 months after the infamous spitting incident, Mason stood at his office window, gazing out at the airport tarmac below where Skyline planes taxied to and from gates. He knew their work was far from complete. Changing a culture wasn't accomplished in days or months. It was a continuous journey requiring vigilance and commitment. But as he watched a diverse group of flight attendants board an outbound aircraft, chatting and laughing together as they prepared for their shift, he felt a cautious optimism. The incident that had thrust Skyline Airways into the national spotlight had been painful and public, but perhaps it had been necessary, the catalyst for confronting uncomfortable truths and beginning the hard work of transformation. Mason turned back to his desk, where reports awaited his attention. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth fighting for. One flight, one interaction, one day at a time.